They said, "Don't sit there, that's for the board members. Volunteers can stand at the back." The words cut sharper than they knew. I stood in the very hall whose foundation I had laid brick by brick, the walls I had painted with my own tired hands, the ceiling I had once patched when the rain threatened to ruin our first meeting. And yet, to them, I was nobody, just a volunteer, a shadow at the edge of the gathering. No chair was offered, not even the courtesy of a gesture. A simple nod was all I received, as if my presence was an inconvenience, as if I had wandered in by mistake. My name, once spoken with gratitude, once written on every first page of every plan, was now absent, erased, replaced by silence. I watched as others took their seats at the table. Men in sharp suits, women with polished smiles, young staff clutching their papers with excitement. They sat with the confidence of belonging, their voices rising in laughter and easy conversation. And I remained standing, unnoticed, as though the years I had given this place had dissolved into nothing more than a rumor. Once this hall had been empty. I remembered the dust clinging to my clothes as I swept the floor before our very first meeting. I remembered borrowing chairs from a neighbor, arranging them in neat rows, praying that enough people would come to make our effort worthwhile. I remembered staying long after everyone had left, locking the doors, counting the coins we had collected in a tin box, and whispering to myself, "This will grow. One day, this will stand." And now it stood. It thrived. The organization was alive, bustling, full of people who spoke of visions and futures. But to them, I was nothing but an old man, standing too close to the doorway. They did not know, or perhaps did not care, that without my sweat, their voices would have no roof to echo beneath. The sting was not in their words alone, but in their ease. The way they dismissed me so effortlessly, as though it were natural, as though the man who had once carried boxes of supplies on his back, who had emptied his own pocket to pay the rent, had never existed, as though history had begun with them. I folded my hands behind my back and said nothing. To protest would have been to beg. And I would not beg for recognition in a place I had built with my own hands. But inside me something heavy stirred, a grief deeper than anger. The grief of watching your life's work turned into a stage where you are not even offered a seat. And so I stood, silent, carrying the weight of invisibility, while others laughed and planned in the house of my own making. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you, when your effort was forgotten or dismissed? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing that, you're helping us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. It was not the noise of the room that struck me that evening. It was the whisper. Whispers are soft, fragile things, meant to disappear into the air. But when they carry truth twisted into mockery, they cut deeper than a shout. I heard it just behind me, two voices lowered but not enough, words falling like stones into the silence I had built around myself. He's just one of those volunteers. Comes once a week, does little helping here and there. Nothing important. The words seemed to sink into my skin, carving themselves into the bones of my chest. A stranger's whisper should not matter. A stranger cannot take from you what you know to be true. But it was not the words alone. It was the way they were said. Casual, dismissive, certain. As though my years of sacrifice had been reduced to a hobby. As though the foundation I had bled into these walls was no heavier than a box carried from one room to another. I stood perfectly still, but inside I was collapsing. The noise of the meeting blurred into a hum as those words replayed themselves again and again. Nothing important. What does a man become when the life he has poured into others is dismissed as nothing? What do decades mean when they are erased in a single careless breath? I thought of the nights I had worked alone, sweeping floors, painting walls, writing plans under the dim light of a single lamp. No one had whispered then. No one had been there to witness the way I carried this place on my shoulders when it was nothing but an idea and a prayer. No one saw the moments when I almost gave up, when failure pressed hard against me, when my body ached but my will refused to bend. And now, those sacrifices were not remembered, not honored, not even misunderstood. They were invisible. The whisper told me something cruel. To them, I was replaceable, a nameless helper, a body filling space at the edge of the room. They saw only the present and assumed it had sprung from nowhere, as if the building had built itself, as if the programs had created themselves, as if the heart that beat within this organization had not been mine. They lived inside the fruit and mocked the seed. I clenched my hands behind my back, my knuckles whitening as if the silence around me needed something to hold. I wanted to turn, to face them, to say, "Look around you. Every brick here carries my fingerprints. Every chair you sit on once stood on my shoulders. You call me nothing, but without my nothing you would not have your something." But I said nothing. Pride can be loud, but dignity often hides in silence. And yet the whisper did not fade. It lived in me, louder than their laughter, sharper than the scrape of chairs, heavier than the speeches made at the front of the room. That single sentence pressed against me until I could feel its weight in my chest. They thought they had spoken lightly, but they had laid a stone upon my heart. It is a terrible thing to be forgotten, but it is worse to be dismissed while you still stand in the room. So I remained there, quiet, unseen, carrying the wound of their whisper. They had no idea they had cut me open, but I knew. And I knew also that the day would come when whispers would not be enough to bury me, because truth always waits for its moment to rise. Their eyes moved across the room like searchlights, quick and sharp, but they never stopped on me. They skimmed past me as if I were part of the furniture, a shadow against the wall, an afterthought not worth noticing. They smiled at each other, those polished, confident smiles of people certain they belonged, and they spoke with eagerness, their voices overlapping as they discussed projects, budgets, and plans for expansion. And there I sat, silent, invisible, as though my name had never been written into the very first page of the charter that gave this place life. I watched them, and in their glances, or rather in the absence of them, I felt the weight of erasure. To be unseen is worse than to be mocked. Mockery at least acknowledges your presence, but to be invisible is to be erased while your body still breathes. My chest tightened with that realization, and I found myself gripping the edge of my chair just to remind myself I was still there. These were not my enemies. These were not strangers on the street. These were people who lived and breathed in the house I had built with my hands, with my sacrifices, with years of devotion no one counted. And yet, to them, I was nothing but an old man occupying space. Their eyes told me, "You do not belong here. You are not part of this story anymore." I remembered the early days, the rented room with broken windows, the drafts that crept in through cracks in the walls, the smell of fresh paint still wet on the boards. I remembered cleaning with my own hands, preparing chairs borrowed from neighbors, greeting the first hesitant visitors with a smile I forced to hide my fear that no one would come back. I remembered lying awake at night, wondering if this dream was foolish, if it would collapse before it began. But I also remembered the moment it didn't collapse, the moment it grew, slowly, stubbornly, until it became the thriving thing it was now. And yet none of them looked at me with recognition. None of them saw that they sat on my labor, my vision, my persistence. To them, I was a body in the shadows, a volunteer too timid to leave. Every laugh they shared cut deeper. Every handshake, every glance exchanged over my head reminded me that I had been replaced, not by someone better, but by time itself. They looked at me and did not see a founder, a builder, a dreamer. They saw an afterthought, a relic, a reminder of something they preferred to believe had begun without me. It is a peculiar cruelty to watch others celebrate what you created and to be treated as though you had never existed. The glances that skipped over me were not careless, they were deliberate, because to acknowledge me would be to admit their debt, and debt is something pride despises. So I sat there, surrounded by the glow of their ambition, while my presence dissolved into silence. I wanted to stand, to shout, to remind them of the nights I had gone hungry so that the doors could stay open another week, of the tears I had hidden when failure loomed, of the sheer will that had carved this place out of nothing. But instead, I remained still, because dignity, once ignored, is not reclaimed through shouting. I was invisible to them, but invisibility does not mean absence. The roots of a tree are unseen, but without them nothing grows. And though their eyes refused to rest on me, I knew the truth they would one day have to face. A house without its foundation will always remember the name of the one who laid the first stone. Good thing we have these older volunteers. At least they help with something. The words weren't meant to kill, but they pierced through me all the same. I felt the heat rise in my chest, burning not with anger, but with humiliation. They called it gratitude, but it was no gratitude at all. Gratitude remembers. Gratitude honors. What they offered was mockery dressed as acknowledgement. A pat on the head to keep me quiet, to keep me in my place at the edge of the room. Older volunteer. The title rolled in my ears like an insult, stripping away the years I had given, the sweat I had poured, the vision I had carried when no one else dared to believe. My mind betrayed me with memories. I saw myself hauling crates up the stairs in the earliest days, my back bent, my hands raw from labor. I saw the faces of those I had convinced to stay when funds were low and hope was lower. I remembered cleaning toilets at midnight because there was no one else to do it, then standing before a group the next morning to inspire them with words I barely had the energy to speak. Those sacrifices had not been part-time gestures. They had been my life. And yet here I was, reduced to a stereotype, the aging helper, shuffling quietly in the background, good for moving chairs, good for smiling politely, but never for shaping the future. The room filled with laughter, and I sat perfectly still, letting the sound wash over me like fire. I looked at their faces. None of them had been there in the beginning. None of them knew what it meant to invest not money, but blood, not hours, but years, not convenience, but entire seasons of life. They sat in comfort, their clothes pressed, their hands soft, speaking proudly of the growth of the organization, while the man who had once carried it on his back was treated as a quaint detail, an accessory in their story. I wanted to rise, to remind them that gratitude without truth is nothing but insult. But I remained silent, because I knew the truth did not need to be defended in that moment. The truth was already here, alive in every corner of the building, in every brick that held its place because of the hands they mocked. My silence was not weakness, it was endurance. Still, the humiliation lingered. It burned in the space behind my ribs and the steady beat of my heart. I had thought I was past the point of being broken by words. I had believed my years had hardened me to mockery, but nothing hardens a man against betrayal dressed as honor. Their laughter was not recognition, it was dismissal. And so I sat, silent, invisible, my dignity pressed down beneath the weight of their false gratitude. But deep within me, beneath the ache, something stirred. A certainty, faint but unshakable. The day would come when truth would rise, when the laughter would choke in their throats, when my name would stand taller than their careless words. For now I endured. For now I bore the sting of their mockery. But I knew what they did not. Truth has a memory longer than their laughter. And truth was waiting. I did not answer them. Their laughter hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. But I breathed it in without a word. My lips stayed closed, my body still, and I told myself that silence was the only armor left to me. To speak would be to beg for acknowledgement, to plead for a place at the table I had built with my own hands. I would not stoop to that. I had carried heavier burdens than silence. I could carry this one too. But silence is a double-edged shield. On the outside, it deflects. It spares you from humiliation, from the further sting of dismissive eyes and careless words. Yet on the inside, it burns. Every unsaid word becomes a brand against your soul. Every memory of what you once were presses harder, louder, until your own heart is shouting in a room where your mouth stays shut. My silence protected me from them, but it did not protect me from myself. I sat there, stiff, my hands folded in my lap, and remembered. I remembered carrying chairs from borrowed rooms when we had nothing, stacking them neatly because I believed one day people would come and fill them. I remembered painting these very walls with my own hands, my shirt clinging to me with sweat, not because I was paid to, but because I dreamed of a place that could stand long after me. I remembered walking home at night, pockets empty, but chest full of stubborn faith that this work mattered. And now, in the same hall I had saved from collapse more than once, my silence made me a stranger. My life's work, my sweat, my sacrifices, my vision, lay buried under their indifference. They saw only the present, the polished shine of the organization they claimed as their own. They did not see the bones beneath the flesh, the years that held it upright, and so my silence became their excuse to forget me. It burned in me. Every laugh that ignored me was a lash across the back of the years I had given. Every careless remark was dirt shoveled over the memory of what had been built. And yet, I said nothing. Because I told myself, dignity does not scream. Dignity endures. But endurance comes at a cost. I felt the cost in the heaviness of my chest and the ache of my throat where words pressed and refused to rise. I wanted, for a fleeting moment, to stand up and tell them everything, to pull open the drawer of my memory and scatter it across their polished table until they drowned in the truth. But I stayed silent, and my silence became my burden. They mistook it for weakness. They thought the old man in the corner had nothing left to say, that his stillness meant emptiness. But they were wrong. My silence was not absence. It was the weight of 1,000 unsaid truths, heavy enough to crush their laughter if ever it was released. And so I carried it, my silence, my shield, my prison. It burned me, but it also kept me upright. For though they had buried me under their indifference, I knew the day would come when silence would break, not with my voice, but with the voice of truth itself. The laughter in the room carried on without me, but my mind drifted far from their voices. I was no longer in that polished hall with its banners, its bright lights, its neat rows of chairs. I was back in the dim rented space we had once called our headquarters, if such a broken place could even deserve the name. The windows rattled when the wind pushed too hard, the floorboards groaned like old bones, and dust clung to everything no matter how many times I swept. And yet, to me, it was sacred ground. I remembered sitting alone at night, the tables littered with scraps of paper and half-finished notes, the air heavy with fatigue. I wrote until my fingers cramped, until the words blurred into each other, until dawn pressed its pale hand against the window. I wrote plans, mission statements, budgets that never balanced but somehow always found a way to work. Each page felt like a promise, and though no one else could see it then, I believed those promises would one day come true. When the money ran out, and it always did, I found other ways. I mopped the floors myself, my knees pressed against cracked tiles, my back aching as I scrubbed. I fixed broken locks with my own tools, patched walls with my own hands, and when the rain threatened to seep through the roof, I climbed up alone and sealed the gaps before the storm could claim what little we had. I told no one, because I wanted them to believe this place was stronger than it was. I wanted them to feel safe walking through those doors. Every wall, every beam, every corner of that hall bore the imprint of my labor. It remembered me, even if the people who filled it now did not. It had absorbed my sweat, my voice, my determination, until it became more than wood and brick. It became a vessel of my hope. And as I sat in the new hall, watching strangers claim it as their own, I realized something sharp and cruel. The walls remember, but people forget. They forgot the nights when there were only 5 of us, sitting in a circle on borrowed chairs, wondering if we had made a mistake. They forgot the winter when I carried blankets into that freezing room so the children wouldn't shiver while we spoke of dreams too big for our pockets. They forgot the time I walked door to door, humbly asking for donations, and came back with nothing but a handful of coins and raw pride in my throat. They forgot because forgetting was easier than remembering their debt. The years weighed on me as I sat there in silence. My body bore the proof. Scars on my hands from hammers and nails, gray streaks in my hair that had come far too early, aches in my bones that never fully left. Each pain was a reminder of what I had given. And yet, in this hall, surrounded by bright young faces, none of it mattered. To them, I was a volunteer, a helper, a shadow clinging to the edges of relevance. But I knew the truth. The truth lived in the walls, in the very foundation that held their voices. The truth lived in the fact that none of them would be here if I had not once believed, against all odds, that this place could exist. My years were not wasted. They were written into the stone, the wood, the soul of this organization. Forgotten by people, yes, but remembered by time. And as their laughter swelled again, I sat a little straighter, carrying the weight of those years with quiet pride. For though they had buried me in their indifference, I knew that history never forgets its roots. And I was the root, whether they admitted it or not. It was not outsiders who erased me, not rivals, not enemies who would have rejoiced in my downfall. No, it was those who came after, the ones who stepped into the house I had built as if it had always been theirs. They walked across the floors my hands had scrubbed. They spoke beneath the ceiling I had patched. They planned futures inside walls that had once echoed only with my solitary footsteps. They enjoyed the fruit but cut themselves free from the root. That was a betrayal. Not mockery, not laughter, but silence. The deliberate silence of rewriting a story and leaving out the first chapter. My name was not cursed. It was worse. It was omitted. When they spoke of the history of this place, I was not there. When they told newcomers about its origins, they began the tale years after it had truly started. My years, my sacrifices, my tears, all erased, as if the beginning were too inconvenient to remember. Forgetting is not always weakness. Sometimes it is choice. And I could see, in their easy conversations, in their polished speeches, that they had chosen to forget me, because to remember me would be to acknowledge the debt they owed. To remember would be to bow their heads to the truth that the foundation beneath their shining success had been laid by hands they now dismissed as irrelevant. And pride does not bow. Pride rewrites. I thought of the faces I had once led, young, uncertain, hopeful. They had looked at me with trust, their faith fragile, asking if I truly believed we could last, if I truly believed the vision would survive. I had carried that trust as if it were gold, even when my own pockets were empty. I had believed for them when they could not believe for themselves. And now, those who inherited what we built did not even speak my name. It is one thing to lose to time. Time forgets us all eventually. But to be erased while still alive, to sit in the very place you created and hear no mention of yourself, that is a cruelty deeper than any insult. It is betrayal wrapped in indifference. And yet, even in the ache, I understood something. They could erase me from their words, from their stories, from their public memory, but they could not erase me from the truth. My fingerprints were here. They were pressed into the mortar between bricks, into the scratches on the old tables, into the blueprints still filed away in drawers. The root cannot be seen once the tree has grown, but it does not cease to exist, and one day when storms come, they will remember that the tree stands only because of what lies beneath. I sat there, silent, carrying the wound of their betrayal. They thought forgetting was easier than gratitude, but I knew something they did not. Truth has a way of resurfacing. Forgotten names have a way of being spoken again, and though they had erased me from their mouths, they could not erase me from the foundation that carried them. And that was where justice waited. The meeting began with the scrape of chairs against the polished floor, the shuffle of papers, the confident rise of voices. I stayed where they had left me, by the wall, half in shadow, the old man in the wrong place, the figure who didn't belong. They spread their documents across the table as if they owned not just the present, but the past as well, as if the story of this place had always been theirs to tell. I listened as they spoke of growth, of expansion, of future projects that gleamed in their words like towers of glass. They painted pictures of progress, of tomorrow's victories, each of them eager to speak louder than the other, to impress, to be heard. And in their talk, there was no trace of yesterday. No one spoke of beginnings, of sacrifices, of roots. It was as though the years I had carried on my shoulders had evaporated, leaving only the clean, easy image they now displayed. From my chair against the wall I could see everything. The eager smiles, the self-assured nods, the way their eyes lit up when the director praised their ideas. And I felt the weight of invisibility heavier than ever. To them I was nothing more than a symbol of goodwill, an aging man with kind eyes and quiet manners, a volunteer, a helper, a relic they could point to when they needed to prove their humility. Look, even the old ones still support us. They saw me as an ornament, not as a cornerstone. I sat in silence, but inside the storm gathered. It was not rage. It was something heavier. Rage burns quickly, but this was a slow thunder, a tightening of the chest, a pressure that filled me until I thought it might break through my ribs. Their words washed over me like waves, but beneath them my thoughts roared. How dare you? How dare you sit at this table without knowing who built it? How dare you plan a future while erasing the hands that gave you the present? And yet I said nothing, not because I was weak, but because silence has a way of sharpening truth. I let their voices rise, let them forget me more with each passing word. I knew they thought I was harmless, too old to fight, too tired to correct them. They mistook my stillness for surrender, my silence for emptiness. But what they didn't know was that silence can hold a storm inside it, and storms never stay quiet forever. I looked around the room, the bright banners on the wall, the photographs of smiling faces, the gleaming plaques celebrating milestones. Each of those milestones carried my unseen fingerprints. Each photograph, each achievement, had been possible because once, when there was nothing, I had given everything. And now I was erased from their story, written out by those who preferred the clean illusion of beginning without struggle. The betrayal pressed on me like a weight, but beneath it something stirred, a certainty, quiet but undeniable. Truth does not remain buried. The more they silenced me, the louder my legacy would one day speak. And as I sat in the shadows, listening to them plan a future as if it had sprung from nowhere, I knew, storms gather in silence, but they do not remain there, and mine was coming. The door opened with a slow, deliberate sound, and all at once the atmosphere shifted. The voices that had been overlapping just moments before, spilling with eagerness and self-importance, fell silent. Even the scrape of pens stopped mid-motion. It was as if the air itself had been pulled taut, waiting. And then he stepped inside, the director. He walked with the steady composure of someone who did not need to prove his authority. His very presence was enough. Each step echoed softly across the polished floor, yet it carried a weight far greater than sound. Heads turned as he moved toward the front of the room, their eyes following him the way planets circle the sun. Chairs creaked as bodies straightened, people adjusting themselves, their laughter collapsing into stiff seriousness. I had known this man once, back when his shoes were worn and his suits were second-hand. I remembered the fire in his eyes when he first joined us, when he still doubted whether this dream could survive, but lent his faith to mine. I remembered nights when we spoke quietly in corners, when I told him to hold on, when I carried both our fears until he learned how to carry his own. And now here he was, the one they looked to for direction, the one who commanded the room with a silence stronger than all their noise. I sat against the wall, my heart heavy, watching. For a moment I wondered if even he had forgotten. Power changes people, and titles build walls between hearts that once beat together. Would he pass me by as they had? Would he let me remain invisible, another shadow dismissed as just a volunteer? He placed his papers on the table, his hand lingering for a second as he scanned the room. His gaze moved across their eager faces, their eyes shining with anticipation. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence held them in place, every breath measured against his. Then his eyes shifted, searching, pausing, and finally landing on me. That moment stretched longer than it should have. I felt it in my chest, a tightening, a mix of fear and hope. His expression was unreadable at first, calm, steady, but I saw a flicker there, a memory, a recognition that the others did not understand. And in that flicker, the storm inside me stirred. I could sense it in the room as well. The others followed his gaze, confused, their brows furrowing as they realized where he was looking. Whispers had filled the hall earlier, but now there was only silence, the kind of silence that trembles with anticipation, as if something important were about to unfold. I did not move. I did not rise. I sat in the shadow of the wall, waiting, carrying the years of invisibility like armor. But in the depth of his eyes I saw it. The past was not forgotten. My name, though unsaid, had not been erased. The walls remembered, and perhaps so did he. The room was his now, every heartbeat waiting on his words. And I knew, before he even opened his mouth, that the silence was about to break, not with my voice, but with his. The director stood at the head of the table, his papers untouched, his voice still silent. But silence itself had become his weapon. It stretched across the room like a taut string, binding every eye, every restless hand, every shallow breath. No one dared to speak until he did. His gaze swept the table slowly, deliberately, moving from one eager face to the next. They straightened under his eyes, forcing their smiles into seriousness, folding their hands as if posture alone could prove their importance. Each one waited to be seen, to be chosen, to be acknowledged. And then his eyes moved past them and stopped, on me. It was not a passing glance. It was not polite acknowledgement of the old man in the corner. It was recognition, solid, unflinching. His stare held me, and for a moment it felt as if the years between us collapsed, as if we were once again those two men in a dusty room, whispering of impossible dreams. The air in the hall thickened, heavy, pressing down on everyone who sat there. I saw it in their faces, confusion, discomfort. They followed his gaze, their heads turning toward me as though they were seeing me for the first time. Whispers had once brushed me aside, laughter had dismissed me, but now their silence revealed something deeper: unease. They didn't understand why the director's eyes lingered on a man they thought irrelevant, a man they had placed at the edge of the room like furniture. I felt the storm gather in my chest, but I said nothing. My silence had always been my shield, my prison. Tonight it became something else, a canvas on which his words would soon be painted. For the first time, silence was not against me. It was for me.
The director's expression did not shift, yet I saw the weight of memory in his eyes. He remembered the nights when there were no tables, no meetings, no titles, only effort, only faith, only two hands willing to carry more than their share. He remembered the foundation that had cost me years of my life, years I had given freely so that others could sit in comfort now. He remembered, even if everyone else had chosen to forget. The room waited. I could hear the tick of the clock on the far wall, each second dragging slower than the last. My heart beat against my ribs with the rhythm of something inevitable. They had erased me from their stories, but here, in this pause, in this heavy silence, I knew the truth was about to return. It was a strange feeling, this mixture of dread and hope. I had long stopped expecting recognition. I had taught myself to live unseen. And yet, as his eyes stayed locked on me, I realized that truth is patient. It doesn't vanish when ignored. It waits, and when it finally arrives, it comes with the force of inevitability. The air was heavy, the silence unbearable. Every soul in the room leaned forward, though no one moved. They all sensed it, that the pause before truth is the loudest moment of all. And I sat there, still, silent, bracing myself for what was about to be spoken. His voice broke the silence, not with thunder, but with the clarity of a bell, calm, steady, undeniable. I want to introduce you to the man without whom none of this would exist. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through every face around that polished table. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Pens froze above notepads, fingers tightened against coffee cups, eyes widened, shifting uncertainly toward me, as if the director's words had torn open a curtain they hadn't even realized was there. I felt the sound of those words more than I heard them. For so long I had endured whispers that dismissed me, glances that passed through me, laughter that reduced me to a shadow. And now, in one moment, the silence I had carried became vindicated. He had spoken what they never dared to say. Not volunteer, not helper, founder, the one without whom none of their proud speeches, none of their confident planning, none of their banners and budgets would have been possible. The silence in the room was unlike any silence I had known before. It was not the silence of dismissal, but of revelation, heavy, electric, alive. I watched their faces, some flushed with confusion, some with shame. They shifted in their seats, their practiced confidence crumbling, because the truth had entered the room and demanded they see me. I sat still. My body did not move, but inside waves of memory rose and crashed. I saw myself in that first empty hall, sweeping floors with a broom older than I was, whispering prayers that one day there would be people to fill the chairs I had borrowed. I remembered walking home in the dark, pockets empty but heart stubborn, refusing to let go of the dream. I remembered how often I had doubted myself, and how many times I chose to keep going anyway. And now, all of it lived inside those words, without whom none of this would exist. They shifted in their seats again. Some glanced at me and quickly looked away. Others stared openly, as though seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile the image they had of an aging volunteer with the truth standing in front of them. And still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence, for the first time in years, was not erasure. It was dignity, The director's gaze lingered on me, steady and unwavering. He had chosen his moment carefully, I realized. He had let them laugh, let them boast, let them erase me in their words, until the very weight of their arrogance made the truth thunder louder. His words were not meant to flatter me. They were meant to restore balance, to remind the room that stories do not begin in the middle, no matter how much pride wishes they did. I breathed slowly, the air thick in my lungs, heavy with justice. Not the kind of justice that comes with shouting or vengeance, but the kind that comes with truth spoken aloud, undeniable and unshakable. And though the room was filled with people, the silence that followed those words belonged to me. The director's voice did not tremble, did not waver. It carried the authority of truth, a truth too heavy to be denied. This is not just a volunteer, this is the founder. His name is written on the very first document, the one from which everything began. The words fell like a verdict, and in their echo the entire room shifted. Every head turned toward me at once. The same eyes that had looked through me minutes earlier, the same lips that had laughed, now froze in stunned silence. Their stares carried disbelief, confusion, shame. Some blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear their vision. Others simply stared, caught between the man they thought they knew and the truth they had just been forced to face. I felt the weight of their gaze, but it no longer crushed me. For years I had carried invisibility like a shroud. They had let me sit in shadows, dismissing me as nothing more than age and goodwill. But now the shadows were gone. I was not a rumor, not a forgotten helper, not a relic tolerated at the edges of their meeting. I was the root they had cut from their story, and the director had pulled it into the light. My name. It rang in the room without me saying a word. I remembered the first time I wrote it at the bottom of that document, the pen shaking in my hand, not from fear but from hope too large for my body to contain. I remembered the smell of fresh ink, the paper pressed against a desk borrowed from a friend, the weight of knowing that my signature meant something would live beyond me. That was the birth of it all, the seed from which this great tree had grown. And now, decades later, that seed had spoken again. I looked at their faces, the younger ones shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their arrogance stripped bare. They had spoken of the future as if it were theirs alone, forgetting the foundation on which they sat. Now they could no longer pretend. My name was there, undeniable, written before theirs ever entered the story. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet mine. Others stared at me with something almost like fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what they had done, of how easily they had erased, how quickly they had dismissed, how cruelly they had laughed without knowing. Their shame was a mirror of my pain, and though I did not rejoice in it, I felt the balance shift. I did not rise. I did not speak. I did not need to. For once, I understood the strength of stillness. Let them wrestle with their guilt. Let them sit in the silence they had given me for years. My presence was enough now, because my name, etched in ink long before their laughter, had spoken louder than I ever could. The director's gaze remained steady, his words hanging in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The truth had been unveiled, and it was irreversible. And as every head turned toward me, I knew that the silence in the room no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. The room had once been filled with laughter, their careless jokes rising and falling like waves meant to drown me in irrelevance. But now, silence pressed down on every corner, heavy and suffocating. The same mouths that had laughed were sealed shut. The same eyes that had brushed past me without care now refused to meet mine. Shame had entered the room, and it was louder than their laughter had ever been. I watched them closely, not with anger, but with the steady gaze of someone who had waited years for this moment.
The young man who had chuckled the loudest earlier shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously against the table before falling still. He lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, as though the truth carved into the foundation of the organization itself had suddenly become visible beneath his feet. The woman who had whispered dismissively about older volunteers stared at her papers, though she did not read them, her cheeks flushed red, her hands trembling faintly. It was strange how the balance of the room had turned. Minutes ago, I had been invisible, erased, my silence mistaken for emptiness. Now it was they who hid, they who sought invisibility, their eyes unable to bear the weight of mine. They could not look at me, because to look at me was to see themselves, arrogant, blind, ungrateful. Their shame filled the room like smoke, thicker than their earlier confidence, choking the very air they breathed. And I sat there, still, silent, unchanged. For years I had been made to feel like a ghost in these halls, a relic tolerated but unacknowledged. But now it was they who felt ghostly, fading in the face of truth spoken aloud. They, with their fine words and polished speeches, could not hide from the simple fact that my name, etched into that first document, would outlast their laughter. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake, doubting whether the struggle was worth it, whether anyone would ever remember what I had given. And here was the answer, not in applause, not in gratitude, but in the bowed heads of those who could not meet my eyes. Their silence, awkward and uneasy, was a confession. It said, "We were wrong. We mocked what we did not understand. We forgot what should never have been forgotten." The storm in my chest quieted then, not because the pain had vanished, betrayal leaves its scars, but because I finally felt the weight of justice settle into place. Justice is not always thunder or applause. Sometimes it is as simple, as powerful, as the sight of arrogant eyes lowered in shame. I sat straighter in my chair, my hands folded calmly, my heart steady. I did not need to scold them, did not need to remind them of their cruelty. Their silence did it for me. Their averted eyes shouted louder than their laughter ever could. You are seen now. You cannot be erased. Your name is heavier than our mockery. For the first time that night, I did not feel invisible. They had tried to bury me in their dismissal, but the truth had risen and it forced them to bow. Not with words, not with gestures, but with the simple inability to look at the man they had tried to erase. And I understood, sitting there in the heavy quiet, that shame is the beginning of remembrance. I did not say a word. My tongue, heavy with years of silence, did not need to move. My chest, often burdened with the ache of being forgotten, did not need to heave out explanations. The truth had already been spoken aloud, not by me, but by a voice no one could dismiss, the director himself, and that alone was enough. For so long I had carried the hunger for recognition like a wound. I had wanted someone, anyone, to remember the nights I had worked by candlelight, the mornings I had stood alone in empty rooms, whispering courage to myself because no one else was there to offer it. I had wanted my name to matter again, to be spoken not as a courtesy, but as a cornerstone. And now, in that single moment, it was. The director's words had restored me without needing applause, without needing theatrics. They were not a performance, they were justice. Around me, the room remained tense, caught between shame and realization. I could feel their eyes trying to crawl away from mine, yet circling back unwillingly, as though the truth pulled them toward me despite their discomfort. They could not laugh now. They could not dismiss me as a kindly relic in the corner. The foundation of their comfort, their careers, their confidence had just been tied back to me, and they knew it. I felt no triumph. This was not victory in the way the world defines it. No cheers, no trophies, no accolades pressed into my hands. It was quieter, deeper. It was the slow settling of balance after years of imbalance, the return of dignity that had been denied. It was justice, not because it erased the pain of their mockery, but because it reminded me, and them, that truth never dies, even when buried. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap. They had once built walls, carried boxes, scribbled plans until dawn. Now they shook faintly with age. But in that moment I saw them differently, not as relics of what once was, but as proof of what still remained. These hands had built something real, something that no one in that room could undo with a whisper or a laugh. And as the silence lingered, I realized that my justice was not their apology. My justice was endurance. I had outlasted their forgetfulness. I had outlasted their arrogance. And now, even without my voice, my legacy had spoken through the lips of another. I did not need to defend myself anymore. The truth had already risen, and it stood higher than all their pride. Justice had come, not in thunder, not in fire, but in recognition. And for me, that was enough. I rose slowly, not because my body was weak, but because the moment itself demanded stillness, demanded weight. The chair scraped softly against the floor, and every head in the room turned toward me. A few seconds earlier, I had been a shadow in their eyes, just another quiet presence along the wall. But now the silence belonged to me. They did not know what to do with it, so they sat frozen, their gazes flickering between awe, shame, and something that looked very much like fear. I did not speak. I did not thank them, did not correct them, did not demand more. There was no need. The truth had already been spoken, and it was heavier than any speech I could have given. Words pass quickly. Truth remains. And the truth was this: I was not just a volunteer. I was the seed planted in the dirt when there was nothing but emptiness. I was the hands that steadied the walls when they threatened to collapse. I was the voice that whispered faith when silence pressed too hard. I walked toward the door, each step a reminder to myself of what endurance means. Their eyes followed me, but they did not stop me, and I knew it was not out of politeness. It was out of reverence, because in that moment they understood that the ground they stood on was not theirs alone. It had been given to them, and whether they acknowledged it in speeches or not, my name was written beneath every brick, every beam, every corner of the building that held them. As I reached the threshold, I placed my hand briefly against the wall. The wood was smooth, polished by time and touch, but I remembered it when it was raw, splintering, when I had pressed my palm there years ago in exhaustion, whispering to myself, "Hold steady, just one more day." The wall remembered me. The floor beneath my feet remembered. The foundation did not forget. And in that realization, I found a peace deeper than any applause could give. I stepped into the hall outside, the air cooler, quieter, freer. Behind me, the room remained still, heavy with the weight of truth. Ahead of me stretched the corridor I had walked countless times before. Though this time, I walked differently. I was no longer hunched by their laughter, no longer diminished by their whispers. I walked tall, steady, carrying not bitterness, but certainty. Time erases faces, that is its nature. Names fade from memory, voices dim, laughter dies away. But truth endures. It hides in the foundations, in the documents, in the work itself. It does not vanish when ignored. It waits, patient, until the day comes when it speaks again. And that night, it had spoken for me. I left the hall, not as an old man dismissed in whispers, not as a forgotten helper clinging to relevance. I left as who I had always been, though they had tried to erase it. The founder. The one who began when there was nothing. The one whose name, though unspoken for years, had always been written beneath the stones they stood on. Because legacies are not erased by silence. They are carried forward in memory that time cannot kill. And mine had spoken at last, quietly, powerfully, unshakably. And as I walked away, I knew I no longer needed their recognition. My name was already carved where it mattered most, into the foundation itself.